Good afternoon and good morning to those out west and good evening to those across the pond. Welcome to today's webinar launching the latest estimates of the U.S. undocumented population produced by the Center for Migration Studies and the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School for Public Affairs. I'm Matt Lysecki, Senior Research and Policy Analyst at CMS, and I'll be moderating today's event. With immigrant communities under an unprecedented level of attack across the country, the need for rigorous data and analysis to inform state and local policy response, direct resources from the philanthropic and NGO sectors, and correct misinformation is high. In response, CMS has produced its 15th year of undocumented population estimates derived from the American Community Survey. The estimates we're discussing today come from the 2024 ACS, the most recent year with available data. For the first time, this year's estimates now also include data on the millions of immigrants, long included within the umbrella of the undocumented, who have been protected by a range of temporary or liminal statuses. To present the latest estimates, we'll hear first from the two leaders of the estimate production procedure and co-authors of a forthcoming article analyzing key findings in the Journal of Migration and Human Security. Ryan Allen is professor of urban planning at the University of Minnesota, and Bob Warren is a senior visiting fellow here at CMS. Following Ryan and Bob's remarks, we'll hear from two additional panelists. First, Philip Connor, research fellow at Princeton University's Center of Migration and Development, will dive deeper into the particular case of immigrants with liminal statuses. Next, we'll hear from Ruth Wassam, senior fellow at the Levin College of Public Affairs at Cleveland State University, and formerly a legislative policy specialist at the Library of Congress's Congressional Research Service, who will discuss the interests of elected officials in immigrant population data. We'll then close out with questions from the audience. A few brief housekeeping items. First, the estimates that we're discussing today are now live on the CMS website, which you can access at data.cmsny.org. We are recording today's webinar, and we'll share the recorded video with registered attendees following the event's conclusion, along with the slides that some of the panelists will be presenting during the event. If you have a question for any of our speakers, please feel free to enter it via Zoom's Q&A function at any time throughout the event. Please include your name and affiliation in the question. And with that, I will hand things over to Ryan to get us started. Ryan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. And thanks everyone for being here today. Like Matt said, my name is Ryan Allen. I'm a faculty member and Associate Dean for Research at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. And it's my pleasure to talk about some of the key highlights in the findings we have from the 2024 estimates. Before I get into some of the details of the estimates this year, let me acknowledge that these are estimates that are coming from 2024. We're now speaking about it in 2026. So this is a necessary lag when you use reliable data that comes from the Census Bureau. We also are certainly aware that there have been substantial changes in federal policies and shifts in migration over the past year or so. And so the landscape today may look really quite different than the one that we're presenting about in 2024. With that said, however, let's talk about our 2024 estimates and go through some of the key highlights. Let's start with the top line number. Our estimate for the undocumented population in the United States in 2024 is 14.6 million people. This represents a significant increase, about 4.4 million more undocumented immigrants relative to 2020. And in the past year, that is from 23 to 24, an increase of 2.4 million undocumented immigrants. However, it is very much a departure from the long downward trend that we noted in estimates starting more than a decade ago. So if you look at the chart currently on the screen, you'll see that between 2014 and 2020, there was actually a decrease in the estimated number of undocumented immigrants of about 1.5 million over that period. Historically, Mexican immigrants have been the largest country of origin group in the undocumented population in the United States, and that remains true in 2024 in our estimates. In the 2024 estimates, undocumented Mexican immigrants are about 5.1 million. of the total 14.6 million. That represents about 35% of the undocumented population in the United States. That said, however, after a period of declining numbers, and you can see that in this chart, the Mexican undocumented population has increased by about 650,000 between 2020 and 2024. That's an increase of about 15% over that period. However, despite this recent increase, there are about 1 million fewer Mexican undocumented immigrants in 2024 than there were in 2014. Again, I want to point out that long-term decline that reversed starting in 2020. So the recent growth is much more attributable to immigrants coming from other regions of the world. So in particular, recent growth in the undocumented population of the U.S. has been driven by increasing numbers from Central and South America. As you can see on this particular slide, there has been modest growth for both groups between 2014 and 2020, but that changed after 2020. In fact, if you look first at the Central American population coming to the United States as undocumented immigrants, it increased over 50% between 2020 to 2024, and now numbers about 3.3 million in the United States. Undocumented immigrants coming from South America showed a similar, if more dramatic pattern. They increased by about 180% between 2020 and 2024 to number 2.3 million in our undocumented population in the U.S. in 2024. The estimates of the undocumented population in 2024 fit well within longer trends that we've seen in the U.S. overall. So there's an obvious question about how accurate might these estimates be, and we have some confidence in these estimates because we do track relatively closely the trends we've seen over a longer period. In particular, what you see in this chart is the proportion of undocumented immigrants relative to the total foreign-born population of the United States. That's the blue bar in the chart, as well as relative to the total population of the United States. That's the orange bar. So in 2024, the undocumented immigrant population represented about 29% of the total foreign-born population of the U.S. and about 4% of the total population of the U.S. These proportions are virtually identical to those same proportions that we see in the years 2000 and 2010. And this consistency, again, gives us some confidence in our estimates for the year 2024. They are different, however, from a couple of other years that you see noted on this chart. In particular, in 1990 and in 2020, where there were lower proportions of the undocumented population. These differences are largely explained by contextual factors that occurred in those time periods. So more specifically, in 1990, we're seeing an immigrant population after a major piece of immigration policy passed in 1986. That's the Immigration Reform and Control Act, or IRCA, which provided a pathway to legal status for a large proportion of the undocumented population. And finally, in 2020, we, of course, were in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that presented substantial challenges to the Census Bureau. So for that reason, it's not unreasonable we would have a slightly different proportion relative to those 2 years. In this slide, I wanted to highlight some of the fastest growing undocumented populations in the U.S. between the years 2020 and 2024. In particular, there are 4 countries that are notable here: Venezuela, Haiti, Ecuador, and Nicaragua. Populations of these groups tended to cluster in relatively few states, but all of these countries of origin had increases above 300% over this period, again, between 2020 and 2024. So in this chart, what you see is the difference in population between 2020 and what we are estimating in 2024 by state for these 4 key country of origin groups. Venezuela had the largest aggregate changes over the time. And if you look at the population of undocumented immigrants It more than doubled those from Venezuela and Florida, and it grew eightfold in Texas. Really substantial changes to Venezuelans in those two states. The largest state level increases for three out of the top four countries of origin occurred in Florida. And it's important to point that out. The one exception is Ecuador. Now I want to pivot to talk more about the characteristics of the undocumented population in 2024. So for this slide and for subsequent slides, you're going to see a group of tables where I have data that's arranged so you can see the characteristics of the undocumented population and how those characteristics differ depending upon how long the undocumented group has been living in the United States. So for the purposes of this analysis, we're dividing the undocumented immigrant population into those who have recently arrived, that is, they've been in the U.S. for less than 5 years. That represents about 36% of the total undocumented population in 2024. Those who've lived in the U.S. for between 5 and 14 years, that represents about 30% of the total undocumented population of the United States. And finally, those who have been in the U.S. for a relatively long period, that is 15 years or longer, that represents 34% of the total undocumented population as of 2024. So if we start first in looking at the age profile of the undocumented population in the U.S., one of the things that becomes apparent is that for undocumented immigrants who have lived in the U.S. the longest also tend to be the oldest. Over 80% of undocumented immigrants who've lived in the U.S. for at least 15 years are age 35 or older. If we look more closely at the data and in contrast, we can see the age profile of the undocumented immigrants who had immigrated only recently, that is less than 5 years in the U.S., was considerably younger. About 70% of this group were younger than 35 years old at the time of the census in 2024. English fluency is also an important marker of adjustment to life in the United States and an important measure of human capital. Here we can see on this particular table that as undocumented immigrants live in the U.S. longer, they also tend to have higher levels of English fluency. Overall, over half, or about 55% of undocumented immigrants reported speaking English well or very well. For those who've lived in the U.S. between 5 and 14 years, 2/3 reported speaking English well or very well. And finally, about 60% of those who've lived in the U.S. for at least 15 years reported speaking English well or very well. In contrast, for those who have been in the U.S. for the least amount of time, those under 5 years, only about 40% reported speaking English well or very well. The educational attainment of the undocumented population is another important indicator or characteristic for how it may shape economic outcomes that they experience. And here we see that overall in the undocumented population, over a third, about 36% of undocumented immigrants had at least some college, while an equal proportion lacked a high school degree. If we look closely at the data, according to how long undocumented immigrants have lived in the United States, those who have lived in the U.S. between 5 and 14 years had actually the highest levels of educational attainment. In this group, nearly half reported at least some college, and only a quarter reported less than high school education. If we look at those who have actually been here the longest, they actually had the lowest levels of educational attainment. Of those who have lived in the U.S. for 15 years or longer, nearly half reported less than a high school degree, while only 25% had at least some college. Finally, I want to talk about another key factor or characteristic associated with the undocumented population, and that is their labor force participation. Undocumented immigrants had a high labor force participation rate overall, but that rate increased the longer they lived in the U.S. Overall, almost 3/4, about 73% of undocumented immigrants were employed in 2024, while 5% were unemployed. About 23% were out of the labor force altogether. In comparison, if we look at the population of the United States overall, about 61% of the total US population was employed in 2024, and about 3% were unemployed. The lowest employment rate and the highest unemployment rate were for undocumented immigrants who were among those who had recently arrived in the US. About two-thirds were employed of this group, and the unemployment rate was around 7%. For those who've lived in the US for at least 5 years, they had high rates of employment, around 76%, and lower unemployment rates between 3 and 4%. With that, I want to turn to my colleague Bob Warren, who will discuss the data and methodology that we use to make these estimates.
Thanks, Ryan. When we started this project 13 years ago, there was very little information about the undocumented population. Now we can make estimates for every variable collected in the American Community Survey for areas as small as 100,000, and we can make the estimates in just a few weeks after the ACS data become available. So today I'm going to tell you how we make the estimates, how we evaluate them, and how we adjust them for undercount. So let's look at the first slide. Excuse me. We have an example here for Mexico. The first line is the number from Mexico who arrived after 1981 who were counted in the ACS. Those who arrived before 1981 are legal residents because they were legalized under IRCA. In the second line, we remove all of the legal residents that we can identify based on their response in the survey. For example, they might be government workers or receiving Medicare or Social Security. There's a whole list of items. But the 1.96 million we removed from the data. That leaves us with 4,875,000. And then we apply a percentage to that number to get down to the actual number counted. That percentage is based on, it's from CMS research and analysis, and it's based on about 30 or 40 years of data, and we update those ratios periodically. When we apply that ratio, we get row number 5, where we have 4,635,000 undocumented migrants from Mexico counted in the ACS. So I've highlighted 3 numbers here. One is just the number counted. The second number is the number of undocumented counted, and the difference is 2.2 million legal non-citizens. Now that legal non-citizen number turns out to be really important for determining the accuracy of our estimates. So let's go to the second slide. What we see here, again, it's from Mexico and non-citizens that arrived after 1981. And you see for 2024, those shaded numbers have been replicated here. The blue line is just simply the number counted in the ACS for Mexico. The red line is our estimate of the number of undocumented from Mexico counted. So just by subtraction, you get the numbers in the green line. Now we do this analysis every year, and the trend in the green line actually is our way of evaluating whether or not our estimate for 2024 is probably accurate. So the 2.2 million for 2024, if that had been 2.5 million, or if it had been 1.9 million, then the number above 4.6 would have taken a sharp turn up or down. But as we see, it's right on the trend line, and we verify the accuracy of this green line using DHS and other administrative data. So for every country of the world, we have evaluated these numbers every year from 2010 to 2024. We're pretty confident that at least our trends and the number counted are pretty accurate. The next step then is to adjust this data for undercount. And so we'll see the next slide. These are our These are our adjustments for undercount. The first column is just the number of years in the US. The second column is the schedule of undercount rates that we used for every year from 2010 to 2021. And you'll notice that they start high in the first year and they decline as people have been in the country longer. Undercount rates decline with length of stay in the country. Now we get over to 2024 and we see a very big change because, as we know, millions arrived in that shaded in that period shaded there. They arrived 2021 to 2024. They were bussed all over the place. Many of them were in shelters, hotels, temporary housing. Very difficult to enumerate that population. So the estimates of undercount are generally consistent. As you see at the bottom of the slide, they're generally consistent with adjustment factors shown in a Census Bureau working paper. So for 2024, for the shaded area, we doubled the largest adjustment factors shown in that paper. That would have gotten us up to about 29% undercount for the shaded area. We had to make an additional adjustment for about 6 countries because we wanted to make sure that the estimates covered all the people who were allowed into the country by the Border Patrol during this period of time. We had a printout from DHS that allowed us to make that additional adjustment for those 6 countries. So that got us up to about 36, 37, 38% for those who came in during that period of time. So the total undercount that we added for 2024 was about 2.3 million. And I think I've shown you how we estimated the estimates, how we verified them, and then how we adjusted them for undercount. And I think with that, I will turn things over to Philip.
Thanks, Bob. Really great to be here, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar. I've had the opportunity over the past several months to collaborate with the CMS team, looking to actually assess the protected population. There's a lot of different words here: liminal statuses, temporarily protected immigrants that are a subset of the broader undocumented population. And this work actually stems back for about a few years, where I actually published an article in the International Migration Review and their 60th anniversary special, where I, for the first time, estimated the protected yet undocumented population. And I'll get into in a moment of all the different groups that make up these this kind of liminal status groups. But needless to say that this is a population that's been growing over the past several years. It is one that has very important policy implications for the US and beyond. And so we wanted to be able to provide some estimates for this recent CMS release for 2024 of this population. Next slide, please. However, back in January 2025, about a year and a half ago, New York Times worked with me and others to be able to assess how much or what share of the population that's undocumented have some kind of temporary permission to remain in the United States. And at that time, I had estimated it would be around 40% in the year of 2024. That was a projection based on a variety of administrative data, as well as the ACS from the previous year, which was in 2023. And you can see that those rounded figures are meant to show how rough that estimate was. And now with these 2024 data, being able to specify that even further, next slide, we can see that that actually is now about 37%, according to the estimates here in these findings, as of mid-2024. 37% of the broader undocumented population had some kind of temporary permission to stay in the United States, whereas the remainder had no temporary permission or no legal status. Next slide. So let me just kind of walk through for just a moment the different groups that make up these temporarily protected population. It includes temporary protected status, TPS, which is often designated by the administration for increments of 18 months. At the time in mid-2024, it was involved 16 countries. It also includes deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA recipients begun in 2012 by the Obama administration, those that entered as children and are having some kind of protections and work authorizations. Also includes those with adjustment to non-immigrant status, more specifically those on a UT visa, victims or witnesses of crime. This backlog has become very long over the years, both for those that are applicants as well as those that are waiting for that actual non-immigrant visa. Also, special immigrant juvenile status includes those that are new arrivals under the protection of the state. This is also an application backlog that has grown considerably over the past several years. Asylum seekers, both affirmative and defensive, and that application queue, again, has grown extensively large and long in recent years. And then if we can think back to 2023 and 2024, we are looking at a time when there was a number of immigrants that were paroled into the United States from Afghanistan, Ukraine, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela, as well as those that were paroled into the United States under the CBP-1 app and other means at the U.S. southern border. So all of these groups make up this very broad population of temporarily protected, which is, again, is a subset of the broader undocumented population. Next slide. Well, as I mentioned before, this population has grown considerably over the years. If you go all the way back to 2012, they didn't even number as many as 1 million people as a subset of that of the broader undocumented population. But by the estimates that we're releasing today, we are estimating that as of mid-2024, there were 5.4 million total protected individuals in the United States. Let me just walk through how that kind of plays out by these different protected groups. So at that time, nearly 1 million were TPS holders, most or more than half from Haiti and Venezuela specifically. About 500,000 DACA recipients, more than 150,000 applicants for special immigrant juvenile status that were in those backlogs. About 500,000 applicants, again, in those backlogs for UNT visas. More than 1 million have been paroled from around the world. And then as many as 3.6 million individual asylum seekers, both defensive and affirmative, with pending cases or in those processing backlogs. So we have seen that both the number of the protected population has grown over the years, as well as the diversity of them in each group has grown considerably. Next slide. Well, one of the things that we did in the methods here is not to assume that these protected statuses are exclusive to each other. If you can kind of think through the policies that were happening in 23 and 24, you can imagine scenarios where you had a paroled immigrant into the United States, maybe from Afghanistan or Ukraine or Venezuela, who later applied for asylum or for TPS. It is quite possible, and we expect it to be the case, as we've heard from instances on the ground, that many individuals had multiple protections at any given moment. So as of mid-2024, we wanted to be able to assess kind of a random selection as to how these different protections would overlap. So these are not based on administrative data in terms of the overlaps, the total populations are, but the overlaps are not based on administrative data. This is based on kind of a random selection model within the American Community Survey data. We set apart DACA recipients for the most part. Although some might have TPS or maybe an asylum claim, most we expect are only under that one protection. But the others, that is not the case. And as you can see from the large bubble here for the asylum claim, it's the largest population size. So I'll relate everything back to that actual group. So of SIJS applicants, special immigrant juvenile status applicants, we say about 68% are having an asylum claim or have a parent or a sibling with an asylum claim, just because that's where it's kind of encoded within the family. 48% of parolees could have had an asylum claim as of mid-2024. 37% of parolees could have also had TPS, maybe not all three. That's rarely the case, but could have one or the other. About 41% of TPS holders could have an asylum claim as well. And then a much smaller share, about 18% of UT visa applicants could also have an asylum claim. Again, these are only estimates to give us a sense of how of these protections may overlap. I know I didn't get into many of the methods here today, but I'm happy to answer those kind of questions on how these were calculated later in the Q&A. And with that, I will turn it over to Ruth.
Thank you, Philip, and good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to thank the Center for Migration Studies and the Humphrey School for the invitation. My objective is to discuss why this research is so important for policymakers, and it is. The unauthorized population has long been misunderstood, mischaracterized, and often maligned. The result are poor policy decisions. On one hand, we have public officials who are denigrating unauthorized residents as criminal aliens, deserving of harsh treatment, even though few actually have criminal records. On the other end, there are leaders who are defending unauthorized residents' right to be in the United States when their immigration status is much more nuanced. And as you can tell from this detailed and thorough analysis we've just seen, we are talking about very nuanced situations. The important part of this research, and this is my number one point, is that it provides solid analysis of empirical data to enable policymakers to have a meaningful discussion about the options to address unauthorized migration to the United States. It provides lots of information and a deeper, richer understanding of the various types of people that we're talking about. That's my first point. Second point, I think this research shows how a preoccupation with border security and enforcement has not been particularly effective. The emphasis in the media for a good many years now has been that policymakers, the Congress needs to do serious, rigorous border enforcement. They did that, they've been doing that. And I sometimes like to use the old expression, fishing with a rifle. The response to what the perceived problem is often a blunt instrument, not necessarily properly suited for what we need to do in the U.S. national interests. Arguably, I would say you would use these data to say that more tactical and strategic enforcement tools aimed at those foreign nationals who pose national security risks and threaten our national interests should be those that we have on the table for policymakers. That we have learned that such a large portion of the population of asylum seekers have liminal status. And you can tell in the what Philip has just explained to us, how that liminal status is derived from humanitarian concerns going on in the lives of these people and in the countries they are fleeing. That brings up my third point. My second point was, too much emphasis on border security with little effective results. Thirdly, it's legal immigration reform that we need to be talking about. And I say that in part, I've been doing a lot of work, and I have a book coming out on U.S. immigration policy in the 20th century. And one of the concepts I talk about is the ideology of the deserving. And by that, I'm talking about family connections in the United States, needed economic skills, and humanitarian relief. These are the values that have been posited and lifted up by policy makers of all the major parties. Really, in the 250 years of our nation, these things have been on the table, and they've been incorporated in U.S. immigration law since the mid-20th century. I'll say them again: family ties, needed economic skills, and humanitarian relief. Now, we clearly saw that in the data that was just presented to us, that 3/4 of the unauthorized population are in the labor force, working and contributing, providing, giving of their needed economic skills. One of the figures that we haven't discussed yet that I already pulled out of the website that CMS has put up is that over 2 million have strong family ties in the United States. Again, whether it's married to a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident, those are individuals who should have a pathway to come here if there weren't other things blocking their way. And of course, the humanitarian reasons that those individuals were given liminal status are matters that policymakers should be talking about, and the extent to which our humanitarian relief is time limited, or i.e. temporary, or those who might be eligible for permanent relief. And that, of course, are all the people that Philip identified in the asylum backlogs. And backlogs is another thing that affects a lot of these individuals, whether it's family-based or economic-based. We have millions of people waiting for who are eligible for lawful permanent resident status or eligible for asylum or refugee status, and they're languishing in backlogs. So that is the main reason, I think, that what this research leads me to suggest is a serious national discussion about reforming legal immigration in ways that address why we have backlogs of people already eligible to come to this country, as well as millions of people in this country who meet the value systems that we embrace for our immigration policy, but aren't eligible for a specific visa or are still languishing, waiting for a visa. Now, I know we want to have lots of time for questions, so I'm going to wrap it up with those 3 points. Great research, important to the policy process, shifts our emphasis away from just talking about border security, and let's talk about national immigration reform.
Thank you, Ruth, and thanks as well to Philip, Bob, and Ryan for your presentations. As Ruth mentioned, we'll now turn it over to questions from the audience. Feel free to enter your question via the Q&A feature at any time. I'll start us off there with one that we received during the presentations, which is a question about terminology, specifically the choice to use the word undocumented versus the word unauthorized, and then how the use of either of those terms factors into thinking about and discussing those with parole, those pursuing asylum, or those with the range of liminal statuses that that Philip presented.
So why don't I take
that? Or Ryan?
let me start and you finish, Philip.
Yes, that'd be great.
I think the terms undocumented and unauthorized, you heard different folks talking today using them interchangeably. We recognize they're contested terms and in some ways lack accuracy given the nuance of the population. And in particular, I think Philip's insight around liminal status. And Philip, why don't you pick up there?
Yeah, so at times, I think it's sometimes appropriate to use the words undocumented and temporarily protected population. It's a mouthful, but it does kind of reflect the change that has happened over time. As I mentioned in that chart that I showed earlier, back in the 2010s, the share of the population that had any kind of liminal or protected statuses was relatively small. It was there, but it wasn't really recognized because of its size. But now it is much larger. That said, and this may come to a question that may come later on, some of those protections are now disappearing. And so some individuals that had liminal status in mid-2024 by these estimates are now losing some of those statuses, namely some TPS designations that have been terminated, as well as parole is no longer being renewed. And there are others. Many have shifted to an asylum claim during that process. And so the asylum population has grown from about 3.5 million, according to these estimates, to about 4.5 million today. This all said, that term undocumented may become even more important in the years ahead as this population is shifting from having some kind of lawful presence to having one that's more undocumented than maybe is portrayed here today.
I want to just add, I use unauthorized in my work because I use it first because it's whether you were authorized to have a visa to enter the country. And you can legally request asylum or protections if you don't have a valid visa. but it's whether you actually had a visa to authorize your entry, or if you overstayed a legal visa that was temporary. So I use it in a narrower sense, recognizing that people with TPS get work authorizations. After so many days, people requesting asylum get work authorizations, and so on. So you can be documented and have legal documents, but still not be authorized to live here permanently. And that's part of the confusion I see in a lot of populations, saying, well, wait, they're not here illegally. They've got an authorization to work. I wouldn't have hired them. So that's why I say that, use the terms I use.
Well,
Thanks, everyone.
I would add to that, Matt, if I could.
Please.
Just in a broader sense, the use of undocumented or unauthorized, just to be honest about it, gets you away from the word illegal. And those are just better terms to use. And a number of years ago, I helped to popularize the use of the word unauthorized because it seemed to fit the population better. But it's true that now it's so complicated, there just cannot be one word to cover this whole population. So I think we just have to live with that.
Thank you, Bob. Next couple of questions are both on the methodology presented and referred to throughout the presentations. Philip, I'll start with you with a question about just asking a little bit more about the methodology for estimating, for instance, those who might have an asylum claim or TPS.
Sure. So we have a number of administrative data to be able to rely on to have indicators as to what groups might be in the American Community Survey that have these protections. So, for example, for DACA recipients, we know based on administrative data, the number that are from every country in the world that have DACA. We know what states they live in based on administrative data. We actually have some demographic data. We're able to use all those indicators to be able to basically select the population within the American Community Survey of the undocumented population to assess that they likely are DACA recipients. As an example, we do the same kind of procedure for temporary protected status based on nationality and how long they've lived in the United States, how long they could have had TPS. It's of varying years. For asylum seekers, we have also nationality data, the number of individuals by different countries that are claiming asylum. And we know that they had to have been here in less than 7 years because that's kind of the maximum backlog length. And so this is basically the kind of procedure we go about in every step to be able to assess. Sometimes it's a selection to be able to kind of have a random selection of those folks, but nonetheless, it is based on administrative data underpinning those selections.
Thanks, Philip. And then Bob, a methodology question for you as well. Asking, and I'll flip back to the relevant slide, asking for a little bit more discussion on line 4 in this table, the use of the 0.95 multiplier for creating the estimates.
Okay, that the numerator of that ratio there, 0.95, is the undocumented population. I think we started out in 2010, divided actually by the number in 3. So when we first created those ratios, it was the ratio of we had estimates of the actual undocumented population divided by the type of population in 4, which still had some undocumented residents. So we had that for every country, and we computed that set of ratios. Like, for example, with Mexico, we know that once we've taken out all the legal residents based on survey response, we know that 95% of them are still undocumented. And we computed that ratio for every country of the world, and we use that from year to year. And as I said in the presentation, that ratio can't change very much because it's based on about 30 or 40 years of data. Even given that, we go ahead and every 6 or 7 years, we do a complete reanalysis of all of that using administrative data and actually using a technique that my co-author Rob Warren and I published a report in migration policy. Well, we published a report a couple of years ago on how to do that technique. So basically what it comes down to is this involves a lot of analysis. Those ratios are based on a lot of data. I think what I'd have to do, to really be honest with you, is just refer you to the text. It's explained so much better than I have managed to explain it.
Thanks, Bob, and we can follow up with a link to the report that Bob is referring to. Another couple questions, maybe I'll send this to you first, Ryan, because it's the jumping off point is one of your slides. But questions about employment data. So the first, I think, a fairly straightforward question about the source of the reported data in the employment slide that we took a look at. And then a couple questions, asking what can we say or what do we know about the percentage of undocumented workers who pay income taxes? And looking at a policy level to understand a little bit better the impact that changes, some of the liminal status changes that Philip mentioned to the asylum system, to the employment authorization process, which is, of course, tied to that asylum system, what those changes might have on employment for recent arrivals in more recent years and moving forward.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Yes, I saw the question come in about the employment status data in particular. So particularly for these data, first of all of our data are from the American Community Survey. So that's what we're basing these estimates on. For employment status, we're reporting how the Census Bureau asked the question. It only asked the question of people who are age 16 or older. All right. So that's the universe of the population that's asked the employment status question. The other characteristics may have slightly different populations. So, for example, when the Census Bureau asks about English fluency, they only ask that of individuals aged 5 or older. When they ask about educational attainment, what we're reporting here are those who are aged 18 or older. And so the universe for each of these characteristics is going to be slightly different, and that's an important thing to recognize. Matt, the follow-up question that was related to this one is about tax payment. We are not reporting anything about tax payment in these data. That's not something that is included here. We do know, however, from other research that is rigorous and been published, that a substantial proportion of undocumented immigrants who are working do pay income tax. They pay state and local taxes, they pay property taxes, et cetera. Right? I'm not in a position to mention definitively a proportion in this presentation, but we know from other research that is, of course, a major aspect of what they contribute to the economy and to the government is tax payment. There was a final set of questions, Matt, that you asked that I'm going to defer to my colleagues on.
Yeah, I can go ahead with that, Matt. And if you could advance this slide on the line bar chart that on the liminal status here. So 5.4 million total protected individuals in 2024. Again, some of those protections have been terminated. However, there are overlapping protections and people have enrolled in new protections since then. And so this does have an impact on those that are having work authorizations through these protections. There could be disruptions that's occurring today regarding that employment authorization document. That said, from some very rough estimation that I've done, it's probably somewhere between 500,000 to 1 million that have had some kind of disruption in that area. Do keep in mind when we talk about this 5.4 million total, there are a number of children that make up this population. They are not all adults. And then not every adult is in the workforce for a variety of reasons. I may not procure an EAD. So roughly speaking, and I've done a little bit of calculation here as of today or as of this year, There could be somewhere between 3 and 3.5 million that have some kind of EAD process. And certainly as there are different policy implications right now occurring in terms of the access to those EADs, that's about the population you can kind of be thinking of here very roughly today compared to in 2024, that it would be in the labor force and would be looking to have that EAD renewed over time.
Thanks, Philip, and thanks, Ryan, as well. Ruth, the next question is directed to you to speak a little bit about, we've discussed today liminal status and the reversibility and precarity of these protections, and wondering how that factors into the congressional calculus for reform and the pressure for legislators. Does this increase urgency, decrease urgency? How does this, do you see, impact the congressional discussion around immigration reform?
Thank you. It's an excellent question. And the origins of temporary protected status and deferred and forced departure and all go way back to when the executive branch would use their discretionary authority to let people in when there wasn't a clear pathway for them to come in. And the classic case was in the late 1950s when President Eisenhower let in Hungarians after a failed coup in Hungary. And Congress later passed a law adjusting their status. So we have had a history of where there have been emergencies or dramatic humanitarian concerns where the executive branch has paroled people in to the United States, and then later Congress has acted. I remember working on this at least 50 occasions of different countries where this has happened. TPS was supposed to deal with that when it was added in 1990. And the thought was that it would be, a temporary circumstances. And it was also broader than refugees and asylum because it covered natural disasters, which, as we know with climate change, are becoming more and more common. So where the debate really comes in for thinking about the temporary statuses, and this would also be temporary worker categories, as well as humanitarian relief that's temporary, is the fundamental question is, what is really temporary? And is this kind of, immigration purgatory? You're in this status where you can't put down a foothold, but yet you do because you're living and working here legally. Whether those categories should exist or we should have other mechanisms of thinking about lawful permanent residence, where people come in and we to live permanently on a pathway to citizenship. That has always been part of our admissions process. When we admit someone for lawful permanent residence, that they're on a pathway if they choose to become a U.S. citizen. So having lots of categories of people who are allowed to be here on a temporary basis creates this situation that is uncomfortable for the foreign national that's living here indefinitely, as well as for our civic society that has embraced that immigrants admitted legally can become citizens. And that's just part of our DNA. So I think it's time to talk about these things and what are the best way forward. In a world where there's a lot of incredible global migration. I don't have an answer to the question in that we should do A, B, and C, but I think and I know that there are people having in-depth discussions about these populations and the extent to which we can have more transitory and global pathways, but it's something that's not clearly defined in our law, and I think it creates a lot of problems. So I just urge for a discussion and a serious exploration for what these policy options should be. I know that's not satisfactory, but it's a tough question.
Thank you, Ruth. The next question is about refugees and expressing some curiosity of sort of where refugees fit into what was presented today, if at all, and if not, what we can say about the refugee population based on the ACS.
Well, I'll add in that we must distinguish between resettled refugees in the United States and those that are asylum seekers. They're very definitively different populations. So asylum seekers here are claiming asylum after they have they've been on U.S. soil, whereas resettled refugees do not feature in terms of this liminal statuses. One important reason for that is the fact that, at least until now, there has been a guaranteed pathway by which resettled refugees will obtain a green card, usually within a year time frame. And so those populations don't figure into these kind of liminal statuses. But I'll pass on to any other colleagues that might want to comment more on how that interacts with our estimates.
Well, I would make a comment on that, Matt. Essentially, when we make our estimates, we look at every year of entry in every country. And when we see that more than 2/3 of the arrivals from those particular countries were refugees, then we don't include those in the estimates. So essentially, for this very same reason that Philip said, they are on a path to citizenship. They can adjust to LPR status, I think, within 1 year. So we don't include them in the population.
Thank you both. I think we've got time for one more question, and I'll send us out and hopefully a bit more of a, at least productively positive note, with a question on what the panelists see as action-oriented next steps that engaged folks, be they researchers, advocates, policymakers, can do with this data.
Well, why don't I start? I would encourage everybody to go to the website and check the data because you can get it not only for the nation overall, but for particular states. And so the first thing I would recommend is to be informed, to think about how this population differs across states, and what kind of characteristics are apparent in the 2024 estimates. I think that all of us have the ability to be informed, and we should be informed, so we can engage in this conversation and debate using facts and understanding the larger landscape. What else would my colleagues recommend?
Yeah, I want to piggyback on what Ryan just said, so I'm going to divert everyone's attention again to the website. It's a treasure trove, really, of state level data, but also the characteristics. And if you're a policymaker or an advocate, you can find defined subset populations within there, whether it be particular liminal statuses that I mentioned today, or perhaps certain groups that you are advocating for, like mixed status families, so children of U.S. citizen children of undocumented parents and so forth, different demographics. These allow you to more pinpoint some of your advocacy or policy-making efforts. So it really is, you have it all in front of you. It's almost like a menu that you can kind of look at and be able to not just inform, but also to direct your attention onto different populations that you want to prioritize in your work.
All right, thank you, Philip. And we are at time, so I will extend a deep appreciation on behalf of CMS once again to Ryan, to Bob, to Ruth, and to Philip. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. And thanks to everyone who attended. We will follow up with the video and the slides in due time, and wish you all a good rest of the day. Thank you.